Public Library. Please give a warm Edmonton welcome to one of the most controversial and provocative messengers of our times.
Well, my stock always goes up when I come to Canada because my wife is from Toronto. And you never think of Canadians as being chauvinists until they cross over into the United States. And every July 1st, she puts a huge, we live in Princeton, New Jersey, she puts up a huge Canadian flag in front of our house and then leaves it there through July 4th. So everyone in our neighborhood has no doubt as to where our loyalties lie. Actually, this July 4th, our neighbor's brother, who's quite sick of this ritual, I heard him walk down the driveway and go, "Fucking Canadians." I wrote a book a couple years ago called Death of the Liberal Class, and it started out as a book on the press. I had been asked by a large publisher in New York, Knopf, if I would write a book. It was a good lesson for me as a writer and should be taken by any writers in the room. Never write a book that is anybody else's idea. Because when I turned it in, the editors of Knopf read it and hated it and said that they would be willing to publish it, but first they were going to assign an editor to excise what they called all the negativity out of the book. So, of course, I scrambled to find another publisher, which I did. Nation Books took it. I had them buy out. You got half of your advance on a book. So I said, just pay them the half. You can have the whole book. And in that transition of publishers, I realized that it wasn't just the press as an institution that has collapsed, but all of the traditional liberal institutions that once made incremental and piecemeal reform possible. The liberal church, which I come out of, the Democratic Party, which once watched out for the interests of working men and women in the United States, public education, which has been decimated, labor unions, all of the pillars of the illiberal establishment essentially don't function anymore. And I asked that question, why? What happened? How did we get to this state? And it led me back to World War I, where on the eve of World War I in the United States, we had powerful socialist movements. We had anarcho-syndicalist unions like the Wobblies, the old CIO, 70 socialist mayors, if you can imagine that in the United States, including in cities like Milwaukee and Schenectady. Some of the most popular journals in the country were socialist, including Appeal to Reason, which had the fourth highest circulation in the country and the masses. And there was this moment where, and of course, the working class paid in blood at Homestead and Ludlow and all sorts of other places in this battle to create decent living standards and working conditions for working men and women, and had turned on this robber baron class, the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers, and built, an effective social movement that was reconfiguring the United States in ways that its elite did not like. And during the war, there was no support for the war in the United States, virtually, very little support. But what happened was that as the situation deteriorated on the Eastern Front with Russia, there became the possibility that the Kaiser could move up to 100 divisions over to the Western Front, easily defeating the French army, which at that point was pretty broken anyway, along with the British. And Wall Street had lent tremendous sums of money to both the British and the French, that if they were defeated would never be repaid. So suddenly there was tremendous pressure on Wilson by the financiers to enter the war. And Wilson, who had, by the way, had run for re-election in 1912 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And so there began this debate, and I went into the archives of the Princeton University Library and actually read the papers from people who were in the room with Wilson, a guy named Arthur Ballard, as well as sort of the grand inquisitor figure of American intellectual history, Walter Lippmann. And Lippmann and Ballard and others argued with Wilson that they could put together a system of modern mass propaganda that could effectively seduce the masses into the war effort, and that those recalcitrant figures, including Eugene V. Debs, who ran in 1912 for president on the socialist ticket and got 6% of the vote, 900,000 votes, they could be dealt with through the more formal mechanisms of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. And Lippmann turns out to be very prescient. He wins the war. His book, After the War, Public Opinion, is a kind of manual. When Chomsky and Herman write their book on the press, they title it Manufacturing Consent. They get that title from Lippmann's Public Opinion. Lippmann talks about the process of manufacturing consent. And what Lippmann and others understand through the writings of Le Bon, Trotter, Sigmund Freud, who have studied crowd psychology, is that people are not moved by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion. And they employ these techniques by creating their own film division, which churns out movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin, by having speakers, they call them 3-minute men, fanning out across the country, having their own graphics division, and creating their own news division that pump out pro-war stories on a daily basis. And every publication in the country has to print these stories, and not only that, editorially has to support the war or they will be shut down. So the masses actually shuts down because they refuse to do it. Appeal to Reason, although it's a socialist journal that had been against the war, concedes and writes pro-war editorial stances and prints these pro-war propaganda, you know, the whole sort of Hun atrocities and this kind of stuff. And when you read the radical intellectuals of the period, especially Randolph Bourne and Jane Addams, there's a deep despair at how effective this propaganda is. That effectively, they argue, the masses have been seduced to call for their own enslavement. And those few figures like Debs or the Wobblies or others who defy it are easily marginalized. There's a very great writer who's not read much anymore named Dwight MacDonald. He writes of this period, and he says, the war was the rock on which these progressive movements broke. Randolph Bourne calls war the health of the state. And the state can accrue to itself a kind of power in wartime that in peacetime the citizenry would never allow it to do. So after the war, you see a radical transformation in American culture, where we suddenly enter what MacDonald calls this age of permanent war, the psychosis of permanent war, where the dreaded Hun is instantly replaced with the dreaded Red. And during the Red Scare after the war, that's actually when the masses are shut down, appeal to reason is shut down, the Wobblies are broken, Big Bill Haywood has to flee the country on trumped-up murder charges, spends the last 10 years of his life in exile in Moscow. Joe Hill is hung in Utah. You have the deportations of Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman. And MacDonald argues, I think correctly, that all of the political theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, had never anticipated this process of permanent war, where you're constantly attempting to ferret out the internal and the external enemy. And what happened to the mass propaganda apparatus is that once the war was over, it instantly migrated out of the government to Madison Avenue in New York and began working for corporations. And that's when you began that process of upending traditional values of thrift and self-effacement, and replacing it with a cult of the self, and with this ability to instill through advertising consumption as a kind of inner compulsion. And I think we as Americans often talk about American values. I think that's wrong. I think what we're talking about are corporate values, manufactured values that have now been disseminated worldwide. And in the aftermath of the war, all of those movements were knocked off balance. It deeply reversed the trajectory in which we were headed. You had in the 1930s, of course, a breakdown of capitalism, and you had a liberal establishment embodied by figures like Roosevelt and his vice president, Henry Wallace, who did what liberal establishments do in a capitalist democracy, and that is make reforms possible to save the system. When Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism, and I think that's right. Following World War II, we had the last great purge within American society of radicals, progressive, populists, thousands of university professors. And when I taught at UT, I went and found Chandler Davis, who spent 6 months in prison, one of our greatest mathematicians, because he wouldn't name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, spent his career teaching at the University of Toronto. But thousands of high school teachers, social workers, writers, artists, directors, journalists like I.F. Stone, probably our greatest investigative journalist, becomes a pariah, can't even get a job at The Nation magazine. And then internally, you have a disemboweling of liberal institutions themselves. So the radicals are pushed out, and then internally, anybody with a conscience, anybody who's willing to stand up to the monolith is pushed aside. And I think American society has never recovered from that process. It left us weakened, tremendously weakened, through corporate forces that were determined to go back to reconfigure the society around a neo-feudal structure, an oligarchic class. The difference being that this time it would be a global oligarchic class. In that process, we saw the transformation of American society from what the Harvard historian Charles Mayer called an empire of production to what he called an empire of consumption, whereby the early 1970s, we, both as citizens and as a nation, began to borrow to maintain a level of consumption as well as an empire that we could no longer afford. And there's a great sort of study of power by our most important political philosopher, Sheldon Wolin, in his book, Democracy Incorporated, where he says that in essence what's happened is that this capitalist democratic system has been transformed, John Ralston Saul calls it a coup d'etat in slow motion, into a system that he describes as inverted totalitarianism. And by inverted totalitarianism, he means that it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't revolve around a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but finds its expression through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in a classical totalitarian regime, you have a reactionary or a revolutionary party that overthrows a decaying structure and replaces it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, the Constitution, yet internally have seized all of the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. This began, of course, to be cemented into place by Ronald Reagan, but was accelerated by Bill Clinton, who embodied essentially this new neoliberal figure. They self-identified liberal who continues to speak in that kind of feel your pain language, and yet betrays the very constituency that he purports to defend or protect. So that under Clinton you have NAFTA, which was probably the greatest betrayal of the working class in the United States since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948, which makes it very difficult to unionize. Under Clinton, you have the deregulation of the FCC, which is not a small issue, because it allows a half dozen corporations to essentially buy up the media landscape, especially the airwaves. So you have Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, now controlling what most Americans watch or listen to. And with my brief encounter with one of your own troglodytes, Kevin O'Leary, you're not immune. I mean, it seems that in America, like, we make every mistake humanly possible, and then 10 years later, Canada decides to copy it, including your assault against the CBC. So in a system like that, you have self-identified liberals using traditional rhetoric, but essentially serving the corporate state. It's Clinton who destroyed our welfare, our traditional welfare system, and 70% of the recipients under the old welfare system were children. It was Clinton that passed the omnibus bill that pumped tremendous sums of federal money to expand our, not only our prison system, but our for-profit prison system. Now at this point, most undocumented workers in the United States, almost half, are now held in for-profit prisons. And I was out at a demonstration in front of one in Elizabeth, New Jersey, the largest, actually, facility by Corrections Corporations of America, which has $1.7 billion in revenue a year and is sold on the stock exchange. Go read their prospectus, which I wrote a column for Truthdig, and you can link to it on there. But it talks about, to attract investors, all the sort of reasons that investing in for-profit prisons is a good idea, because there's high recidivism, because we've managed to stymie any kind of reform of drug laws, because 1 in every 100 Americans are actually in prison, because with a population increase, it's estimated that the prison population, I mean, it's just absolutely chilling. And then finally, of course, Clinton ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, which, because of Chrétien, you were saved. That's why you don't have a banking crisis in Canada. Not only did that precipitate the national meltdown and global meltdown, but what is often below the radar is that we have over 100 bank failures a year in the United States because of that, because essentially local banks became hedge funds. Now, Clinton got something for what he did, and that was that by the 1990s, he had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he had more. And Obama functioned in 2008 the same way Clinton had functioned. The system had imploded because it's essentially a system based on speculation. The bankers were, in the form of Paulson, quite literally on their knees, looting the U.S. Treasury to save themselves, and along came Barack Obama. And these systems of mass manipulation are nothing if not very good at taking our pulse. They knew precisely what it is we wanted to hear. And Obama essentially was thrust forward as a brand. He functioned in the same way that a few years ago Calvin Klein and Bennington used to have people of color and HIV-positive models to associate their brand with progressive politics and a risque lifestyle. That's exactly how Obama functioned, and that's why in 2008, after he was elected, the Obama campaign was awarded by Advertising Age its top annual award of Marketer of the Year. He beat Nike, Apple, Zappos, because the professionals knew precisely what he had done. And Obama has, the tragedy of Barack Obama is that he has codified the destruction of international and domestic law. that was put in place by the Bush administration, including the egregious assault on civil liberties, which are worse under Obama than they were under Bush. Now, the corporate state internally, in the National Security Council and everywhere else, has run all sorts of scenarios, and they know full well that materially things are not going to get better for us, with the effects of climate change and with the deterioration of the global economy. You see the shock waves already rippling throughout Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. But we're not immune from that. And they are creating a security and surveillance state to essentially keep us in check. And that has been the great contribution of the Obama administration, perhaps more than anything else. And that has been a complete stripping away of what were traditionally constitutional rights, so that it's become quite terrifying. I used to wonder, the two great dystopian writers, Huxley and Orwell, was Huxley right or was Orwell right? Well, it turns out they were both right, because Huxley, Wolin in his book says that essentially access to cheap credit and mass-produced consumer goods are forms of political pacification. Well, now the credit is gone, and the cheap goods aren't so cheap anymore. And so we're transforming ourselves from the Brave New World to Orwell's Oceania. And we see how the elites now are beginning completely to replicate, with the decimation of the working and the middle class, are beginning to replicate the configurations of power that Orwell laid out in 1984, where you have an inner party that's 2 to 4%, you have an outer party that's the public relations industry, which is truly evil, the security apparatus, and corporate managers, 12, 14%, and then 85% of us are proles, hanging on by our fingertips. So under the Obama administration, we have seen a frightening destruction of constitutional rights, especially the right to dissent. So you have the radical interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act by the executive branch as giving them the right to assassinate American citizens. And of course, I'm speaking in particular of the Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son, 2 weeks later, was on nobody's terrorism list. And if you read that 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act, you'll see that it is in essence a declaration of war. I don't think there's any serious legal scholar who believes that that gives the executive branch the right to serve as judge, jury, and executioner of another American. Then you have the FISA Amendment Act. The FISA Amendment Act retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens. Why was it retroactive? Because when Verizon and AT&T and all these big telecommunications companies handed our personal data to the government in violation of our right to privacy, and we now know that all of our personal information is being stored in huge supercomputers out in Utah, there were several cases working their way up in the lower courts, and they knew they'd lose. So their lobbyists walked in our form of legalized bribery and wrote the legislation. Of course, the lobbyists write legislation to ensure that they would be protected, that they were given retroactive protection for the crimes that they had committed. The Obama administration has used the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act is the equivalent of our Foreign Secret Act. It was actually passed by Wilson, put into effect in 1917, and it was for somebody who gave classified or secret information that could harm the government to somebody who was defined as the external enemy. Now, between 1917 and 2008, it was used 3 times against whistleblowers. The first time by Richard Nixon against Daniel Ellsberg. Obama has used it 6 times. That's twice as many since between 1917 and 2008 to shut down people within the government who have exposed war crimes or fraud or criminal activity, including the CIA official Kiriako, who just started a 30-month prison sentence for purportedly giving information about war crimes, including torture, to reporters at the New York Times. Finally, the Obama administration a year ago signed into law Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. I sued the president in federal court over Section 1021, which permits the U.S. military, overturning 200 years of domestic law, to seize citizens who substantially support. That is not a legal term, it's not material support, it's amorphous, it's undefined. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces. Again, a nebulous term. When I was the two lawyers, I worked with Carl Mayer and Bruce Afron, when we went through the State Department terrorism list, because of especially my work in the Middle East, it turns out that I had spent time with 17 either individuals or groups who were on that list, including Al-Qaeda. And there's no exemption for journalists. I had covered the conflict in Central America for 5 years, in El Salvador and Nicaragua during the Reagan administration, and when I got to El Salvador, the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. And the Reagan administration routinely attacked those of us who were reporting these atrocities as being fifth columnists, members of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or the FMLN in El Salvador. And I knew, once this law was signed and put into effect, that essentially it transferred that transformed that linguistic condemnation into a legal condemnation. Last September in the Southern District Court, Judge Catherine Forrest declared that section of the law unconstitutional. And the reaction of the Obama administration for me was quite telling. Now, we knew they'd appeal, but they didn't just appeal. On the day of the ruling, they went to Judge Forrest, who was the first judge, as far as I know, in the last decade to stand up and defend the rule of law. And her 112-page opinion is really worth reading. It talks about the erosion of the separation of powers. It brings up the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned without due process by the military, and says that this law essentially opens up the possibility for the military to seize people for what they believe and hold them indefinitely. In the language of 1021, that's till the end of hostilities. But of course, and not only that, they can be held in our offshore penal colonies. They can be shipped out of the United States. And the Obama administration went into Judge Forrest's chamber and said, well, we need a temporary stay, meaning put the law back into effect until the appellate court, which is before the Supreme Court, hears the case. Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused. So then they demanded an emergency hearing. This was late Friday afternoon for 9 a.m. Monday morning with the appellate court in New York. They got it. They went into the appellate court. They again asked the appellate court for an emergency stay, which they got. Now, for myself and the lawyers, and by the way, I was later joined in this lawsuit by Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg, that could mean only one thing, and that is that they are already using the law. Because otherwise they would not have reacted so aggressively. And what we suspect is that they are, at this point, holding in some of our military detention centers like Bagram, U.S., Pakistani, dual nationals, and others. Because if they were holding U.S. citizens, and if they were denying them due process, and if this law was allowed to stand, they would be in contempt of court. All of the impediments now have been lifted against corporate capitalism, as you who follow the tar stands understand, and the shredding of Kyoto here in Canada. Karl Polanyi in 1944, a great economist, wrote a book called The Great Transformation, in which it's a study of unfettered capitalism, which, as Karl Marx understood, is a revolutionary force. And that it is the nature of unfettered capitalism, unregulated capitalism, to turn everything into a commodity. So that human beings become a commodity, the natural world becomes a commodity that you then exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And because of that, because there are no self-imposed limits to this insane quest for profit, you have built within that system its own self-destruction or self-annihilation. And you can see it. You can see it not only with the tar sands, but you can see it with the response to the melting of 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice, the death throes of the planet. And what is the response of the corporate state? It is to send up ships to drop $500 million drill bits and extract the last vestiges of oil, natural gas, minerals, and fish stocks. It makes Herman Melville's Moby Dick the most prescient study of the Western character. The Pequod, the ship they were on, named, of course, for an extinct Indian tribe, were all, headed down this path by our version of Ahab. You have Harper. And as Ahab says, my means are sane, my motive and my object mad. It's insane. We're killing the ecosystem for profit, and we're standing by and not responding. And at this point, there is nothing internally within the formal systems of power that will save us. When Joe and I set out 2 years ago to write this book, I don't know how many of you know Sacco's work. He's amazing. I met him in Bosnia, and where he was working on a book called A Safe Area, Gorazda. And I'm not really well versed, not versed at all really in comic novels. And we traveled out to Garage together, and I watched him work. And I realized here was an absolutely brilliant journalist. What he does is that he then takes this long-form narrative journalism and he draws it out. So cartoonists don't quite know what to do with him. Journalists don't know what to do with him. We did a story together for Harper's Magazine out of Gaza called A Gaza Diary, where we went and lived in a refugee camp called Han Yunis for 10 days, where almost every single day we saw Israeli soldiers shoot live rounds at children. And then we went to see these poor little kids in the hospital, and in some cases went to their funeral. And in the course of this article, we ran into survivors of the 1956 occupation of Gaza by Israel. During the Suez Crisis, for 100 days, Israeli forces occupied Gaza. And because there had been Fedayeen or guerrilla attacks, they went into places like Rafah and Han Yunis and lined young boys and men up against walls and executed them by the hundreds. And it's interesting that if I knew Hamas quite well, the early leaders of Hamas, including Dr. Rantisi, who was eventually killed by the Israelis in a targeted assassination, also knew Niza Rayan. They did the same thing to him, only when he was with in his house with all of his children and his family. But Rantisi, as a young boy, grew up in Han Yunis, and the origins of Hamas come out of these kids in Han Yunis who watched their uncles, their brothers, their fathers being taken out by the Israeli forces and executed. The Harpers, for some reason, decided we put that in. We thought it was an important point. They took it out. They said it was history. That's the problem with working for. And Joe was so incensed that he spent the next 6 years, and he would take little jobs here and there to fund it, to go back and find all the living survivors from those massacres, and wrote what I think is one of the seminal works on the Israel-Palestine conflict, Footnotes in Gaza. And I wanted to write a book about the human beings who are being sacrificed now in these sacrifice zones, these places that have been forced to kneel before the marketplace, those places that went first. And because these people are invisible, I wanted the book to have a visual component. I wanted people to see these people as much as was possible. And so we started out, and we began where it all began, which is on the Western Plains in Pine Ridge, where the whole demented project of ceaseless exploitation began. The whole template for the American imperial power, where the gold speculators and the timber merchants and the railroad magnates went in and stole the land and physically eradicated those indigenous communities who stood in their way. When I was writing the book, I went to the Princeton University Library. I'd heard about this. You can't get them in a bookstore, or I couldn't. And I got Karl Marx's notebooks, the notes that he wrote, because I had heard correctly that Marx made detailed study of the Iroquois in particular, as well as other indigenous communities, and looked at the ethic of a communal structure within those communities, how it worked. And I think that part of the reason that the Western expansion was so violent was because not simply they wanted the resources, but they had to destroy those competing ethics, to decimate those cultures, herd them. They were originally prisoner of war camps before they became tribal agencies, before they became reservations, to create a culture of dependence and to break them. Now, when you go to Pine Ridge, at any one time, 60% of the dwellings, many of which are sod huts, have neither electricity or running water. The average life expectancy for a male in Pine Ridge is 48. That is the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti, and it has an 80% alcoholism rate. And here's where it started. Here was the first sacrifice zone. We went from there to the post-industrial city of Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, and not surprisingly the most dangerous. The shipyards once employed 36,000 people. RCA Victor was there, Campbell Soup was there. It's all gone. You have decimated urban post-industrial landscapes, but in Camden there literally is nothing left. You can drive down whole streets that are just abandoned with trees coming out of the roofs. The only thing that functions in terms of the informal economy are the 100 open-air drug markets. You have no supermarket. It's a food desert because when you're that poor, you can't afford vegetables being trucked in from Florida or California. So people subsist primarily on grease and fat, donut shops, and fried chicken. And we just saw, although per capita is the most dangerous city in the country, they just fired, the Camden City fired the entire police force because it was unionized, and recreated a countywide police force where they would rehire some of the officers at 50% of their original salary without benefits. What's happening in these sacrifice zones is the kind of template. Now that there are no impediments left, first they went there, and now they're coming for the rest of us. We went to the coal fields of southern West Virginia, and if you fly over the Appalachian Mountains, which we did, it'll rip your heart out. Hundreds of thousands of acres destroyed because they don't want to dig, the coal companies don't want to dig down for the coal seams, so they blow the tops off the mountains and create toxic wastelands, huge billion-gallon impoundment ponds filled with heavy metals and toxic sludge. The air is fetid. We went into these old hollers, these old coal camps, where everybody has had their gallbladders removed. Cancer is an epidemic. The water is fetid. It stinks when it comes out of the tap. It's discolored. You go into the nurse's office in the elementary schools, and there's just rows of little inhalers for kids because of the coal dust. And there, of course, big coal. They own the judges, they own the politicians, they own the media. They even sponsor the textbooks in the schools to glorify big coal. We then went to the produce fields, Immokalee, Florida. There you have the perfect worker in the eyes of the corporate state. No legal protection, constant fear, abusive sub-minimum wage working conditions, handling all sorts of toxic chemicals and pesticides. And there you have traditionally, it used to be African Americans who worked those fields. You have, since emancipation, constant uncoverings of slave operations, which have never ended. Places where workers, now they tend to be from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, held behind barbed wire. We interviewed a worker who for 2 years, along with other workers, had been chained at night in the back of a truck. Finally, after 2 years, 3 of the workers punched a hole in the roof, got out, went to the police, they raided the place, and almost none of the workers wanted to testify because their families they'd already been told that their families would be killed back in Mexico, Honduras, or Guatemala, wherever they were from. One worker did. We found him. And after the trial, they show up at 4 in the morning to try and get on the buses to go out to be picked by a crew leader to work. He became blacklisted. He couldn't get work. And when Joe and I discovered him, he was sleeping under a mango tree at night and, hopeless alcoholic, utterly broken. And you are now seeing, as all of the protections are lifted against the rest of us, this kind of, in essence, slavery being replicated in all sorts of fields and professions that had never existed before. The hotel industry, the garment industry, workers, in essence, kept against their will and forced to work in a kind of, at best, a kind of debt peonage, and often for no wages at all. Now, when we wrote the book, it was always called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. But when we began, the revolt was conjecture. And then, as we were in Florida, in Immokalee, when Zuccotti Park took place and the Occupy movement arose. And we knew that, of course, was the final chapter of the book. That finally this was the emergence of a movement, a mass movement, that understood the reconfiguration of power. That none of the formal systems, Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies writes that the question is not, how do you get good people to rule? Popper says that's the wrong question. He said, most people attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is probably Obama, or venal, which is Romney or Bush. The question is, how do you make the powerful frightened of you? And that comes through building movements. And I think that has been the failure of many of us, is that we have been seduced through systems of mass propaganda into believing that those within entrenched systems of power are going to watch out for their interests. And they've proven quite effectively that they have no intention of doing that. I teach in a prison, and it's sort of the opposite of teaching in a university, where when you write up your course description, because it has to be passed by the prison authorities, it has to look absolutely as banal and boring as possible. So I wanted to teach the inmates a course. I told the prison officials, I want to teach them American history, about the founding of our country and how and once it immediately got through, I went to my local bookstore and bought every inmate in my class a copy of Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. And these are all African American men, and it's heartbreaking because nobody's ever taught them their own history. And my first class, I tried to run it as a seminar, which turned out to be a disastrous mistake because it somehow, no matter what the topic was, after about 5 minutes, it just all became about the hood. So after that, I stopped, and I said, no seminars, it's a lecture, and if you have a question, you have to raise your hand. But I would be reading Zinn. I'd never met Zinn, which breaks my heart. I always admired him immensely. I'm just reading his Politics of History essays, which are brilliant. But boy, when you teach him, you realize how important a historian he was. And these inmates would be listening to this stuff, and I'd hear them go, damn. I go, we've been lied to. But Zinn understood that within the United States in particular, was more of a socialist tradition in Canada, but within the United States, the last thing that our quote-unquote founding slave-owning fathers, white male, wanted was a popular democracy. They were terrified of it. And they created all kinds of mechanisms to prevent it. So they disenfranchised women, Native Americans, African Americans, people without property, men without property. They created the Electoral College, which is how you get Al Gore actually achieving or receiving 500,000 more popular votes than George Bush, and we end up with Bush. It wasn't because of Ralph Nader. But even Gore says now he won, because they stopped the recounting in Florida after 2 counties, because they knew, and the Supreme Court appointed Bush by fiat. And I think still to this day, Americans have an emotional inability to understand that, in essence, they live in a banana republic. So you saw throughout American history, Zinn points out, this struggle between mass movements who sought to open up space to create democracy. So that was what the abolitionists did. That is what the suffragists who fought for women's rights did. That's what the labor movement did. And that, of course, is what the last great mass movement we had, the civil rights movement, did. And none of these people ever achieved formal positions of power. And yet you could argue that until April of 1968, when he was assassinated, Martin Luther King was the most powerful figure in the United States, because when he went to Memphis or Selma or Birmingham, 50,000 people went with him. And as Cornel West correctly points out, the civil rights movement was a legal victory. But King and Malcolm X understood that until there was economic reform, there were mechanisms within the system to essentially keep most African Americans trapped within what both King and Malcolm, at the end of their lives, called internal colonies. So for the upper third, and we're seeing with the assault on the middle class, by the way, that of course it is people of color who sink back into poverty first, you integrate a small percentage, no more than a third, while for the bottom 2/3 of African Americans in the United States, things are worse than when King and Malcolm were agitating in the 1960s. And that's why you see the explosion of the prison system, where 60% of those people, of course, are of color. And the Occupy movement, I think, was a way by which we began to examine once again that inequality, the mechanism of institutionalized economic repression. And it understood that none of the parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican, nobody was going to come to our aid, that we were going to have to rebuild these movements that had been destroyed. I think that part of the reason, or perhaps a major reason, that the Occupy movements were physically eradicated in a coordinated national effort overseen by Barack Obama was that they expressed the sentiments of the mainstream, that they were in essence a mainstream movement. And you could see that on the weekends when mothers and fathers from New Jersey would come to Zuccotti Park and push their strollers up and down the park. And that was something that terrified the power elite. You know, it's interesting with the NDAA, it was a kind of window for me into the impoverishment within the media landscape. None of the cable networks that purportedly deal with news, neither Fox nor MSNBC ever mentioned the NDAA case, because it had bipartisan support, because MSNBC, which attempts to funnel energy back into a dead political system on behalf of the Democratic Party, knew that it didn't make Obama look good. I wonder where all those strict constitutionalists were who were, on Fox night after night, the only media organization that covered it, and I worked for the New York Times for 15 years, and I have my critique of it. I mean, the unwritten credo of the New York Times is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for access and money. But the only media organization that covered it was the Times. They sent a reporter, and when Judge Forrest issued her ruling, they wrote an editorial supporting it. And for me, that was a kind of frightening moment when I realized how few, because at least they understood what a story was. They understood what news was. Everything else has just descended into a kind of frightening version of court gossip, whether it's spun from one side or another. I don't know what's going to come next. I don't know whether what rises up will even be called Occupy or look like Occupy, but I know something is coming. If the state had the capacity to respond rationally, if our liberal institutions worked instead of being paralyzed, then they would have responded to the ferment around the Occupy movement by calling for a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, instituting a rational health care program, which means, of course, nonprofit universal health care, forgiving student debt, and creating a jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25. Instead, they responded exclusively in the language of force. And it's always the ruling elites who determine the configurations of revolt or rebellion. I've covered movements all over the world. I covered the first and the second Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. And you know as a reporter when the tinder is there. What ignites it is often banal. And there's a kind of frustration among the activists who have seen their hopes and their dreams crushed. And yet I think at this point it's important to keep that flame alive. I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel in Prague during the Velvet Revolution. Havel had begun with Charter 77, his great essay, The Power of the Powerless, written in 1978, that talks about the importance of living in truth. When I was in Prague, on every street almost, there were posters of a Charles University student named Jan Palach, who when the Soviets had invaded to overthrow Dubček in '68, had gone to Wenceslas Square and lit himself on fire. 4 days later, he died of his burns. Hundreds of university students carried his body towards the cemetery. They were broken up by police. When his grave became a shrine, the communist authorities exhumed his remains, cremated them, gave the ashes to his mother, and forbade her from reburying them. And 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people went to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was in Wenceslas Square when the great Czech singer Marta Kubashova walked out on the balcony. In 1968, she had gone on the airwaves to sing an anthem of defiance when the pro-Soviet regime was installed. Her entire recording stock was destroyed. She was banned from the airwaves, and she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. And she walked out. There were probably 500,000 Czechs that winter evening in that square. She walked out, began to sing that anthem, and every Czech in that crowd knew every word. The East German opposition began in Leipzig, mostly run by Lutheran clergy who would hold candlelit vigils. Never more than, at the beginning, just a few dozen, maybe a couple hundred. Suddenly, by the fall of 1989, 70,000 people. The communist dictator Erich Honecker sends down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. That paratroopers refused to do so. Honecker is out of power within a week. I think Havel's right. I think that the systems of governance are so corrupt, and so criminal, that speaking this truth is deeply frightening to them. And it creates a kind of paralysis within the systems of power. You see it with the New York City police. Most of the physical abuse carried out on the streets of New York were done by the white-shirted officers, not the blue uniform police. In fact, they would fraternize with the Occupy activists, and their demeanor would always change when the white-shirted officers would show up. And that's because to supplement their income, they're rent-a-cops. For $37 an hour, they're working for Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase, and they see these guys walk by them in their $8,000 suits and treat them as if they're a piece of furniture. They have brothers and sisters-in-law and others who have lost their jobs and been foreclosed. And I think one of the reasons that the security state is pushing through the NDAA is that finally they don't trust the police to protect them. They want to have the capacity to call the military out on the streets. I'm just going to end. Cornel West and I did a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs in Zuccotti Park, and which was broadcast by the public radio station. We had New York City school teachers who had lost their jobs testifying, and people had been pushed from their homes. And then several hundred of us marched on Goldman Sachs, and this is just that account, which is towards the end of the book. Faces appeared to me moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows, a pathetic collection of middle-aged fraternity and sorority members. They were not the faces of the blue uniform police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children, convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind. The small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon, learned in business schools and on trading floors, effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us is filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that comes with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. It is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Short Hills, New Jersey, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity, used to justify their privilege, and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules, they make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody, and for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum: if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter, and without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day and come to me in the dark. They force me to remember, and they make me choose sides. Thank you.
Are you willing to do a Q&A?
Sure. Yeah.
We do have time for a Q&A, and we have two members of the Edmonton Public Library staff, Richard and Christy, that will have microphones to move throughout the crowd. So just if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand so we can identify you.
Hi, Chris. Probably my favorite work of yours is The Death of the Liberal Class, wherein you describe what a rebel is, a person that refuses to be bought off. My question really speaks directly to your work and to actually the theme tonight, which is the freedom to read, which at its core is really about censorship. I learned recently that John Pilger's documentary, The War We Don't See, was censored and in fact banned in the United States by the Lannan Foundation and censored by Democracy Now! And I find that very disturbing because we're now in the 12th year of the global war on terrorism, and what's in that documentary is not really controversial. But yet, many self-styled liberals, rebels, remain silent in the face of that censorship. So my question to you is what do you do to avoid the undue influence of foundations that want to limit the freedom of speech? And did you raise your concern over that censorship by Lannan and Democracy Now!
I didn't know about Democracy Now! I did know about the Lannan Foundation. I did ask the Lannan Foundation about it. I mean, they have a story as to why they didn't do it. I haven't seen the film. I mean, the fact is the liberal class is bankrupt. And it's about, I mean, if you take what the Democratic Party stands for in Europe, it would be a far-right party, especially with the expansion of the drone attacks. So self-identified liberals, at this point, it's about sort of burnishing their own sort of personal morality or standing. On the day the Iraq War started, I was on a national public radio program called Fresh Air, and I was given 12 minutes or whatever it was to argue as to why we should not invade Iraq. And then there was a 12-minute response. I didn't know who was going to do the response. And after I finished, I suddenly start hearing the voice of Michael Ignatieff. Now, I've known Michael a long time. I don't understand Michael's infatuation with American imperial power. I believe he's Canadian. He wrote a book claiming he was Canadian. It actually sort of broke my heart. Michael's a smart guy, but it would just typify the cheerleading for the war by the liberal establishment was deafening. And I had dinner a week ago with Michael Moore, and if you remember, Michael got up at the, is it Academy Awards or Oscars? I don't have a TV, so I don't know any of this garbage. But anyway, he got it. Was an Oscar or whatever it was, or Academy Award? I don't know. Maybe it's the same thing. I don't know. But he denounced the war, and he said, he was, of course, roundly booed. He said he went back to his hotel room alone, rather than go to the after parties, and flick through the channels and watch every liberal pundit just tear him to pieces. And I think what was so refreshing for me about the Occupy movement is that they'd seen the moral bankruptcy of the liberal establishment, and they realized that they couldn't trust it.
But my concern is the censorship of and Lannan's a pretty liberal foundation. I mean,
yeah, I can't speak to that issue because one, I haven't seen the film, and two, I wasn't there during the process, so I only know what they said. I wasn't internally part of the process. Yeah, I know what. I heard they didn't sell enough tickets, but I don't want to get into this. I know, but we're walking into an area I don't really have firsthand experience on.
The screening. Pilcher managed to have it independently screened at the very same theater in Santa Fe, and it was sold out, and they had turned people away. Yeah. So.
I'm not denying that the censorship is there, but you're asking me to comment about an incident that I was removed from.
Sorry. I know that I'm probably not the best person to ask this, but I would really like your thoughts on the Idle No More movement and how it fits into the resistance.
I think that, and movements in the States are evolving. I think the Idle No More movement, along with the student protests in Quebec, did things that the Americans have to learn from. And most importantly is sustaining the movement. And in Quebec they didn't quite get what they wanted, but they rattled the power elite. And that's when I mean that something's coming. I think that that you're seeing glimpses of it here. I mean, look, probably the most important action now in terms of civil disobedience within the United States is over the Keystone XL pipeline. And that pipeline, and it looks pretty certain that Obama will build the northern leg of it. He's fast-tracked the southern leg. That's going to require kind of unification between us and you. it's just another example of how these corporate interests in the service of short-term profit are quite willing to kill us. And that what is the response of the Harper government? It's precisely the same response of the Obama administration, and that is to destroy civil liberties. I mean, look at the G20 in Toronto. Walk away from climate accords, harass activists, criminalize dissent. I mean, you know, this is all, it's the same paradigm because it's the same forces behind it that we're undergoing in the United States. And so, yeah, I think the Idle No More, I mean, I think it's great, and I'm just waiting, I'm waiting for something in the States. I mean, I keep going to stuff. I'm going to go up to Hancock Air Force Base at the end of April with Veterans for Peace, and we're all going to get arrested. That's where they do the drone attacks. I don't like being arrested. It's more time than I care to donate to my government. But I really don't think we have any choice left, and we have to physically obstruct that pipeline. We have to stop that pipeline for our children. I don't have an arrest record here, so maybe I can come up here and start my probation in Canada.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for coming. That was really great. I really appreciated listening to you talk. I've been listening to the press kind of mutter on about how Obama's supposed to announce some policies that are supposed to address climate change in the States within the coming weeks. I was wondering if you could comment on how effective or ineffective you think they may be.
Here's my best guess, which I steal from my friend Ralph Nader, who knows more than I do. He thinks that Obama will approve the northern leg of the XL in exchange for some kind of carbon tax. That's what he expects. But look, corporate money runs the show. There's a front page story in the Times yesterday. Obama's created a super fund, $50 billion he wants to raise. I mean, this sort of money-saturated politics, I think with the 2010 Citizens United ruling in the Supreme Court, it's over. I mean, anybody who continues to believe the rhetoric of a Barack Obama or have faith in the Democratic Party, there's nothing left to say to them, I don't think. I mean, it's like writing letters to Uncle Joe Stalin, you know. At least you have Harper, who's sort of transparent, you know. I mean, he's not very adept at covering up what he is.
Thank you for coming. We've been following you for a number of years in our home. We get very excited when your name is part of our kitchen table. So thank you for being you, and thank you for doing what you do. But we watched a lot of you, as we did watch a lot of Jeffrey Sachs, professor of Columbia, during Occupy. And, you know, he had said once that, you know, there's politicians in the crowd. So really, we need to be our future and that kind of stuff. But obviously, not all of us are as intellectual as some. So why have you never gone into politics? Because people would vote for you.
The Green Party asked me to run. But you know what? I come out of, I think Chomsky's right. I think Julian Benda, the great French intellectual, is right when he writes The Treason of Intellectuals. And that is that you have a choice in life between serving two sets of principles. You can serve privilege and power or justice and truth. And the more you make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And if you're a politician, you know, no matter how truthful you may want to be, you are trying to get something from your audience. I mean, I went through this with the Black Bloc. I was very critical of the Black Bloc in the Occupy movement because I felt that, I mean, if the Black Bloc want to go off and do their stuff, fine. But because we were attempting to build a mainstream movement, the black bloc became a very effective tool in the hands of the security state in frightening away the mainstream. And so when I wrote a piece that was, okay, a little incendiary, I call them the cancer of Occupy. And you know, when I would be with Occupy activists, even people who weren't black bloc, they felt betrayed. They felt angry, as if I'd attacked the movement. And I said, look, the moment I need your adulation, or I have to walk through Zuccotti Park and I need I'm finished as an intellectual. I have to be able to step out and say, as far as what I can tell, a very unpopular truth. And I've gone through periods, you know, getting up before crowds like this, even in Berkeley in 2008, and denouncing Obama. I would be booed and people would walk out. And I think that, you know, I'm a writer. I take part in civil disobedience, but I consciously don't organize it because I have limited amounts of time and energy. So I think that when you get in, you know, in that sense, I'm with Chomsky, and, you know, I come out of a kind of anarchist mindset that the problem is power, and that it just sort of doesn't matter who holds it. Once you hold it, and it's certainly borne out in my own experience as a reporter, once you hold it, you start to lie, you start to compromise, you want it, and I always want to be a kind of, I always want that freedom to critique power and to make unpopular or present unpopular ideas even when those who I support and like can't hear it. And that's why I don't do, plus I don't want to ride around and shake people's hands.
And my question is, do you have hope that people might care enough to go to a website, sign up, and be able to vote?
Yes, that's what we need to do. On every motion, every day.
I really want you to go to the XL and the Keystone, chain yourself to a bulldozer. The problem with the internet is that it's a great tool for logistics. It's a useless tool for organizing. The only way we organize is to get out in the street and confront them to their face. And look, I voted for Gene Stein. I voted for the Green Party. But as Emma Goldman said, you know, if voting was that effective, they'd make it illegal. The idea is to make people in power scared of us. You know, there's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where it's 1971 and Richard Nixon, and there's a huge anti-war demonstration outside the White House, and Nixon has surrounded the White House with empty buses as a kind of barricade, and he's sitting at the window, wringing his hands, going, Henry, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where we want people in power to be. That's it.
My question, I do have a question. As a citizen, as I look at all these numbers, you know, people like Nate Silver in your country, there are different pollsters in my country, all the different people, the talking heads from left and right and center, give me all this information. How as a citizen can I interpret this? How can I decide what's truth? Because I feel like I'm being lied to. Jobs. No one's really creating jobs.
Well, take your TV and unplug it. And carry it outside your house and put a sign on it that says free. I don't have a TV because I don't want to speak in the language they give me. And I spend a lot of time in Empire of Illusion talking about the danger of severing ourselves from a print-based culture. Totalitarian societies are image-based. They do spectacle really well. I mean, if you watch the cable shows in the States, the emotional energy that people put into the most ridiculous sporting events, I guess I can't say anything about it, except hockey, of course. Sporting events, reality TV, it's like Cicero, you know, at the end of the Roman Republic, where he watched the citizenry invest their intellectual and emotional life in the arena. And you won't understand, nobody on an electronic system of information is going to explain to you how power works. You have to read Sheldon Wolin. I actually like Saul's book, Voltaire's Bastards and Unconscious Civilization are also good. You have to read. You have to read Chomsky. You won't get it from those, and even in the good electronic media like Democracy Now!, you're still only going to get sound bites. So I don't have a TV, I don't tweet, I don't have a Facebook page, I don't have a web page, and I try and read 3 to 4 hours a night. Because I don't, even when you use a phrase like the war on terror, you're linguistically trapped, even if you're against it. Because the war on terror is a tautology. You can't have a war on terror. That's a tactic. You can't make war against a tactic. And so, and one of the, it was really one of the most moving things when the police came and shut down the Occupy encampment. Afterwards in New York, I found people mourned the most about Zuccotti was the People's Library. We had 5,000 books. When I went to Zuccotti, I'd always sit there. It was run by these fussy, retired New York City librarians. Really. They were like cataloging them, except that there was no checkout. You just took it. And it was really moving. And it was, and especially when the cops came, they destroyed the books. They took the books, they threw them on the street, and then they used like dump trucks to run them over consciously. And there were people at that moment when they invaded the park in the People's Library, as they were doing it, standing as the police were literally destroying the library, reading poems that had been written in Zuccotti by Occupy activists as they did it. And so one of the I think beneficial or even moving aspects of the encampments was the teach-ins. We would go down and do them. The discussion groups, the fact that people were coming together in a kind of town square to share ideas that were not being shared through electronic mediums. And they were sharing them together. So yeah, I really think TV is poison. I really do. Yeah. We do one more?
One more question.
Okay, we'll do one more, which is why libraries are important.
Hi, Chris. Last question, I guess. If we are to dismantle these entrenched systems of power, how are we to go about actually doing that? I'm curious on your thoughts of what the future could actually look like if we dispossess governments and corporations of power, and are there any positive examples to look to for a new world order?
Yeah. I had dinner a couple weeks ago with Father Daniel Berrigan, who's 93. I found in Zuccotti a lot of kids didn't know who he was, but he's a poet and a Catholic priest and an activist who did things like burn draft records during the Vietnam War, spent 23 months in federal prison because of it. And Berrigan says we're called to do the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it. And then we have to let it go. That the Buddhists believe, or call it karma. Faith is the belief that it goes somewhere, that the good draws to it the good. Even if all of the empirical evidence around us sort of point otherwise. And even at the end of your life, if things are worse, it doesn't invalidate the struggle that you've carried out. I gave a talk in New York a few months ago, and in a YouTube clip in Zuccotti, I had been exhorting the occupiers not to taunt the police. And I had said, look, these blue uniform police have to deal with these white-shirted assholes every day. We only have to deal with them a few hours a day. So after this talk, a man came up to me and he said, I'm a white-shirted asshole. And it was a really good lesson for me, because I realized even in the hierarchy of the, he said, I'm a white-shirted asshole and I read your books. And I said, even in the hierarchy of the New York City Police Department, even if there's only one, I shouldn't have made that statement. Because you never know who it is you're going to reach, who it is you're going to change, who it is that will come to that event and decide for the first time that they're going to stand up. And so I come out of seminary. I can't justify it perhaps through fact-based evidence, but I think that's what faith is. Faith, and it's why I am categorically nonviolent. Faith is the belief that the good draws to it the good. And I have seen in Eastern Europe, I have seen in Belgrade, I have seen moments when enough people break through the chains of fear and stand up and speak a truth to power that utterly discredits that power and destroys it. And I think internally within the corporate state, it is that decayed and that rotten, and it gives me hope. Thank you.